Hi fourth graders, it's Mrs. Burke here with a video math lesson. Today's lesson is going to show you how you can convert a decimal into a fraction as well as a fraction into a decimal, and then we'll take a look at how we can do the same to mixed numbers. So before you get started, today's lesson will be a million times easier if you work with a place value mat. This place value mat is going to come in handy this week because we're still getting comfortable with reading numbers and writing numbers or decimals. Next week, hopefully you can move away from the place value mat, but for activities today that we're trying for the first time, this is going to be extremely helpful. So if you hopefully already have one made from the lessons that you've been doing all week long, but you're going to want to make a place value chart. I would use a tens place, a ones place. I always include a place for a decimal point. And I even added this word and here to help me read my decimal. I never say point, I always use the word and. And then I have a tenths place and a hundredths place. So make yourself one of these before you get started. You could always pause the video if you're not ready. Okay, so for today's lesson, we're gonna start by looking at a couple of fractions. And what this lesson is really testing, besides how do you convert a decimal into a fraction, is do you know how to read and write decimals and fractions? If you can read these, it's going to be pretty simple for you. If you're still uncomfortable with reading fractions and reading decimals, it might get a little tricky. So this is why we're practicing. So I have the fraction here, and I see the number 62 as my numerator and 100 as my denominator. For today, all of our fractions are going to have a denominator of either 10 or 100 to represent tenths and hundredths. So over here I have a denominator of 100, which means we're dealing with hundredths. So when I read this, I'm going to read it as 62 hundredths. So think about what that sounds like, 62 hundredths. 62 tells me the number I'm going to be writing. That word hundredths tells me in my place value mat where I'm going to finish writing my number, in which place value, the hundredths place. So watch this. I'm going to start by putting my decimal point because I know no matter what, I'm changing this fraction to a decimal, so I'm going to need a decimal point. And now it wants me to write the number 62, and it wants it to finish off in the hundredths place. So my places are up top here. Here's my hundredths place. So if I write the 62 and it finishes in the hundredths, look, 62, where did my number finish off? In which place? The hundredths. And then this is the number 62 hundredths, which is equivalent to the fraction 62 hundredths. All right, so that's how I can write this one. Let's try this. Let's try reading it first. I see my numerator is 36, my denominator is 100. So I should be reading this fraction as 36 hundredths. So I'm going to come to my place value mat. I'm even going to kind of put my finger here. Since it's hundredths, I know my number has to end in this place value column. So I'm going to put my decimal, and the number was 36 hundredths. So I'm going to fill in my 36, and it's going to end in my hundredths place. So I read this decimal as 36 hundredths, which is equivalent to 36 over 100. Now this next fraction is going to look a little different. And you should notice that this fraction has a denominator of 10. So I do not read this as hundredths because it's in parts of 10. So this instead is read as tenths. So my fraction here represents 7 tenths. Now using the same strategy on my place value chart, I'm going to place a 7, and it has to finish off my number in the tenths place. So I'll even move my finger here so I know where I'm going to finish. I'm going to put a decimal point, and then the number 7, and it finishes in my tenths place. So I read this as 7 tenths. Now, you can also put a 0 here. That's very, 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 very common. It's equivalent if I just have this number, but a lot of times you'll also see that 0 in the ones place, which is fine. So it's still read as 7. Where does it end? Tenths. All right, on your place value mat, try this one. This one you should be reading as 4 tenths. So I'm gonna come to my place value mat. I'm gonna finish in my tenths place because I read it as 4 tenths. I'll place my decimal point. I can put the 0 if I want. And now I need to write 4, and that number ends in the tenths. So 4 tenths. Awesome. Next up, Mrs. Burke always likes to introduce the tricky ones. Now for this fraction reads as 9 hundredths. Not tough to read, but this one does give a little trouble to students because right away they say, well, I know it's the number 9, which it is. But you have to pay close attention to where you're saying the place value ends. 9 hundredths. So my last digit 9 has to end in my hundredths place. So I'm gonna put the value of 9 in my hundredths. Now, you're not allowed to have blank spaces. You can't. So how do I show that this is part of the number, but it doesn't have value? I'm gonna use the number 0. So now my number reads as 9, and look up to see how I read it, 9 hundredths, which is equivalent to this fraction. Try this other trick one. Think about how you would read that. Think about which place value your number should be ending in. And make sure you don't have any spaces in place values. Any place value that's included needs to be represented with a digit, even if it's 0. So we read this as 5 hundredths. So I don't have any ones. I have 5 with the value of 100th. And I can't have any blank spaces, but it doesn't have value in my tenths, so I'm just gonna put a 0 there to hold the space. And now my number reads 5 hundredths, okay? Now I'm gonna show you, and you could, for this part, just flip your place value mat over. Now I'm gonna show you, well, you'll flip it back and forth, but how I can turn a decimal into a fraction. So now I want to read this. I'm going to fill this decimal in on my chart as, there, I have my decimal point and the digit 8. My decimal point comes here and the digit 8. So now how do I read this? I read this as 8. Where does it finish off? Tenths. So how do I write 8 tenths? 8 is my numerator. My denominator would be tenths. So you don't have to flip your chart over. I just wrote it underneath. 8 tenths. Let's try the next one. How do I read this number? When you read it, it tells you how to write it. I read this as, maybe you're not sure how to read this. That's okay. Fill it in here. I could just say, oh, I see decimal point 82, so fill that in. Decimal point 82. Now, how do I read this? 82. And where does it finish? Hundredths. So I'm gonna write that fraction as 82, and those are hundredths. 82 hundredths. All right, try this one. All right, we read this as 31 hundredths, but just to be sure, I saw a decimal point, a 30 and a 1, or a 3 and a 1, and the chart tells me how to read it. 31 hundredths. So what would that look like? A numerator of 31 and a denominator of hundredths. 31 hundredths. All right, last one for the decimal into a fraction. This is my trick one, so be very, very careful. Think about how you read this number. I know I have a 6. Let me see what place value it finishes in. I'm going to copy this, decimal point 0.6, decimal point 0.6, so I read it as 6 hundredths. So even though it's one digit, my 6 in my numerator, it doesn't mean it's going to be tenths. Here, my 6 finishes in the hundredths place, so this is the fraction that it's representing, 6 hundredths. All right, good job with that. Now we're going to do one more extension of this, and we're going to throw in some mixed numbers. Now a mixed number is when you have a whole number and a fraction represented, such as 1 1/2, 5 1/4, 15 2/3. Those are all mixed numbers. So you can change your mixed number fraction into a decimal. How do I do that? Well, here we're still paying close attention to our fraction. If I pretend my mixed number is not there, or my whole number is not there, this fraction says 43 hundredths. But I have a 1 here. Which place value could represent 1 whole? The ones place. So before I was substituting a 0 because there was no value. I only had numbers less than 1. Well, here I have 1, and then I also have 43 hundredths. So how do I read this mixed number as a decimal? 1 and 43 hundredths, and that's how I write it as a decimal. Look at this one. How do I read this? This shows 4 wholes and 2 tenths, or 4 and 2 tenths. So how many ones do I have? 4 of them. And what about my decimal or my fraction? I have 2 tenths. So I'm going to have the number 2 finishing in the tenths place. 4 and 2 tenths. Now, if you put a 0 here, this number is equivalent. It has the same value. However, this number shows 4 and 20 hundredths. I only wanted 2 tenths, so it's going to look like this instead. All right, try this one. What would it look like? That we read that as 7 and 7 tenths. So I'm going to come to my ones place, draw the 7 that's represented, and 7, and it finishes in the tenths place. 7 and 7 tenths. Here comes the sneaky one. Take your time with this one. It might be a little trickier. I read this as 5 and 9 hundredths. So in my ones place, I'm going to put a 5. And here comes the tricky part. 9 hundredths. So I know I need to show the digit 9, but it has to appear in my hundredths place, which is over here. So now what can I do with this tenths place? It's represented in my number, but it just doesn't have value, so I'm going to put a 0. So now I read this number as 5 and 9 hundredths. Okay, and now let's take some decimals and turn them into mixed numbers. How about this one? How would I read this? This is red. 12 and 83 hundredths. I'm just going to copy it onto my mat. 12 and 83 hundredths. So how would I write that as a mixed number? Well, this side of my decimal point shows my wholes, which would be 12. And this side of my decimal shows the fraction, the number less than 1. This shows 83, and it finishes in my hundredths place. So it shows 83 hundredths. So this mixed number would be 12 and 83 hundredths. Don't mind the construction noises that go on in my house. All right, last one, try this one. How do I, or actually we'll do 2 more. How do I read this? How do I represent this? All right, I read this as 5 and 4/10. If you weren't sure how to read it, just put it right into your place value mat. 5 decimal point 4, and your mat helps you read it. 5 and 4/10. So now I have to think about the mixed number. Well, how many wholes do I have, or numbers larger than 1? Right here, 5. And then what fraction is represented? 4/10, which is written as a numerator of 4 and a denominator of tenths. 5 and 4/10. All right, last one, guys. Finish strong. Here we go. How do I read it? How do I write it? If you're not sure how to read it, put it right in your mat. Now your mat will read it for you. 2 and 31 hundredths. So how many wholes do I have in front of the decimal? That would be 2. And then my fraction would be 31 as my numerator. And my denominator is where does the value of this number end? In the hundredths. So that's my denominator. 2 and 31 hundredths. Okay, so that's today's lesson. Take your time with your work carefully, don't make any silly errors, and make sure you're working with a place value mat. It makes everything way easier. Okay, you can make one just like this. Have a great day, Stewart School, and I'll see you soon. Take care.